I'm back in the recording studio for this church leader tool called Leading Change from the Inside Out. It'll be a tool that will go in depth into not necessarily what change to make, but how to go about it in a way that is well organized and hence successful in whatever change, and leaders always need to make changes, whatever change you're going to be about. So let's start off with a little bit of inspiration. We can always take some inspiration from Jesus. And if we look at Jesus' ministry, there were all kinds of changes that Jesus successfully navigated. We could look at Jesus talking about the kingdom of God and how it had arrived. Or we could look at how Jesus called new leaders and leaders who were not the usual establishment, quite unexpected, in fact. We could look at the new teachings that Jesus brought and shared, or the new miracles that Jesus performed. Or we could talk about the new attitudes that Jesus encouraged, especially about outsiders and those who didn't belong. And of course, central to Jesus' ministry is the dying for salvation change that was an incredible change. Or, of course, the resurrection. We could look at Jesus' ministry as one change after another and let that inspire our own leadership for change. Or because I'm a Lutheran and I'm primarily teaching for a Lutheran audience, we could look at the changes of Martin Luther and be inspired by those changes. How Luther simply led the Reformation, which means to change. Martin Luther had all kinds of new teachings that were part of the change of his day. He changed the way the church thought about the authority of the Bible, and that was very central to the Reformation. Or the change of justification by grace through faith that were made right with God by the free gift of God's love through faith. Or the change that Luther led of having worship be in the language of the people instead of Latin, moving to German so the people understood what they were hearing, or the change of the priesthood of all believers. These are all amazing changes that are part of the Lutheran history. So let both of those change leaders inspire you. And a third thought as we get into change would be to normalize change, to help people understand that change is part of God's plan. One of the obvious ways to point that out are the seasons or aging. These are built into the fabric of life, that change takes place. And so when we start to realize that this is the way God designed things, then we can roll with and adjust to change a little bit more easily. Another piece of advice in the midst of change is to remain calm. And that's often hard to do. Change for the person who's leading it or for those who are being led can often be anxiety producing. But we know in the functioning of our brains that when we become anxious, we can't think and be rational as well as we should. So remaining calm is an important part of leading change. And also acknowledge that when you lead change, you will not have everyone. I love the chart that's called the Diffusion of Change Bell Curve. And it describes that you won't often get everybody on board. There are folks who immediately jump on board, the innovators. What you mostly need to do is get over the largest section of the bell curve. But there are those folks who are kind of laggards, is the way it's described in that illustration, and they just don't change easily. So no, you might not get everybody on board. So those are some things to just kind of start us off with change. Now, as I get into some specifics about change, I would ask you to think about a change that you're either in the midst of or that you know is coming for your congregation or organization, and think about that change with these ideas in mind. It'll help you apply that change that you're going through or that's coming soon with these things in mind. So number one, leading change from the inside out, have a plan. Well, of course, this always makes sense. A plan helps to guide and direct. Doesn't mean that you'll end up following it completely, but in any endeavor, going on a vacation, it's always easier to have some general plans in mind that help to guide. So start out with a plan. Put it down on paper. You can share that with other leaders and have them tweak it and adjust it. But start out with a plan. Also, try and start out with the why. The why is a really important question, and it helps people get on board. There's a wonderful teaching by Simon Sinek where he talks about the importance of why. And I thought this was so helpful that I'm going to insert this piece of Simon's teaching about leadership and focusing on the why.
As it turns out, there's a pattern. As it turns out, all the great and inspiring leaders and organizations in the world, whether it's Apple or Martin Luther King or the Wright brothers, they all think, act, and communicate the exact same way, and it's the complete opposite to everyone else. All I did was codify it. And it's probably the world's simplest idea. I call it the golden circle. Why, how, what? This little idea explains why some organizations and some leaders are able to inspire where others aren't. Let me define the terms really quickly. Every single person, every single organization on the planet knows what they do, 100%. Some know how they do it, whether you call it your differentiating value proposition or your proprietary process or your USP. But very, very few people or organizations know why they do what they do. And by why, I don't mean to make a profit. That's a result. It's always a result. By why, I mean what's your purpose? What's your cause? What's your belief? Why does your organization exist? Well, as a result, the way we think, the way we act, the way we communicate is from the outside in. It's obvious. We go from the clearest thing to the fuzziest thing. But the inspired leaders and the inspired organizations, regardless of their size, regardless of their industry, all think, act, and communicate from the inside out. Let me give you an example. I use Apple because they're easy to understand and everybody gets it. If Apple were like everyone else, a marketing message from them might sound like this. We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? Meh. And that's how most of us communicate. That's how most marketing is done, that's how most sales is done, and that's how most of us communicate interpersonally. We say what we do, we say how we're different or how we're better, and we expect some sort of behavior, a purchase, a vote, something like that. Here's our new law firm. We have the best lawyers with the biggest clients. We always perform for our clients, do business with us. Here's our new car. It gets great gas mileage. It has, leather seats. Buy our car. But it's uninspiring. Here's how Apple actually communicates. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. We just happen to make great computers. Want to buy one? Totally different, right? You're ready to buy a computer from me. All I did was reverse the order of the information. People don't buy what you do, people buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it.
As Simon points out, if you can help people understand the why, that will help to motivate them in that direction that you see as being important. I particularly highlight this because our whys in a faith community are so important. There's a wonderful, wonderful description in Adam Hamilton's book, Leading Beyond the Walls, where he describes particularly 3 whys that will help to focus any leadership decision. These are the whys that you need to have firmly in mind about your leadership. And if you can tie any change that you're making into any of these whys, this will help to provide motivation. So his whys are, why do people need Christ? Why do they need Jesus? Why do people need the church? And why do people need your church? So if you can, tie your change into one of those whys. Now, at this point, I want to introduce a wonderful book that's called Leading Change by John Cotter. John has done some wonderful work and writing on the topic of change. And one of those things that he starts out with is establish a sense of urgency. Now, in the rest of that book, I'm just going to quickly run through some other important descriptions that he has, and we'll actually come back to one of those. But he also says create a guiding coalition, have some other folks be part of that. We'll come back to that as well. Develop a vision and a strategy, communicate the change vision, empower others to act on the vision, generate short-term wins, consolidate gains and produce more change, keep the ball rolling, in other words, and then anchor new approaches in the culture. Well, I just want to go back to that first one that Cotter pointed out, creating a sense of urgency. In fact, what Cotter did after he wrote Leading Change is he realized how important that sense of urgency is. So he wrote a book just focusing on that called A Sense of Urgency. See, the problem here is that if you don't create a sense of urgency, people will say, oh, well, sometime in the future, we'll look at that change. And often that gets pushed off well into the future. And I think this is especially a challenge for the church, where our timeline could be dozens, decades, hundreds of years. But we need to realize that our urgency comes perhaps sometimes for the health and vitality of the congregation, or connecting someone with a faith life that they don't have. Help to people to understand that if we don't address this change, there will be sometimes dire consequences. So create that sense of urgency, Cotter said in his first book and in his follow-up book as well. And then another point that Cotter talked about was involving other leaders. If you try and tackle a change all by yourself, it's going to be a big struggle. But if you have others as a part of this, it will help. I love the illustration that John Maxwell gives in a number of his different writings. He talks about the first church that he served as a pastor, a number of long-time, probably lifelong members of that church. And John realized that if he tried to lead the change all by himself, it would fail. So there was a long-time, much trusted farmer who was part of his leadership, and he would go out and talk with that farmer about the things that he was thinking about. He would kind of convince that farmer that this was worth engaging in. And then when they would come to a leadership meeting, it wasn't just John, but it was this much trusted leader within the life of the congregation. And that helped things to flow much better. So you need that guiding coalition. You need those other leaders who are involved, who are going to stand side by side and help the changes take place. So then a fifth thing about leading change is communication. Help people understand where you're going and the steps that you're taking along the way. You don't want to surprise people along the way. If you can help well communicate what you're working on, that will help the change to be much more successful. Help them understand why and help them understand what things are going to change along the way. And then again, back to Cotter's learnings, create and share short-term wins. Help people understand how the change is working. One of the things that I love to do is to tell stories about how a change is starting to unfold and how it's blessing people, how it's brought in a new member, or how it's helped someone to grow deeper in faith. When you can help people understand why this change is necessary with a couple of good illustrations or stories, that will also help that change to continue forward. And then another piece of advice from John Cotter: So John's written 3 books about change, Leading Change, A Sense of Urgency. And then John also went back and did some follow-up work on changes that have taken place primarily in the business world. And then he wrote a 3rd book called The Heart of Change, The Heart of Change. And what he identified in this book is also really important as we lead change. And that's if you can tie change to how people feel about something, find the heart of it. Sometimes the rational or the specific plan will not be as successful as if you can touch their heart and their emotion. If they can see how it's, again, blessing someone, or imagine even how it's going to touch someone's life, change their life, that sense of heart, that emotion will go much further than any specific system or rational explanation. So find the heart of your change. Another important thing about leading change is help people understand the pain. Pain often helps to motivate change. The illustration I often use is if you're carrying too much weight and your knees are hurting, sometimes that gives you the motivation you need to lose some weight because of that pain. Or another illustration from a number of years ago when I was leading a lot of change in a church. I was sitting with my church council president, and I wanted to understand how he felt about change. And so I asked, and he said, well, I'm an accountant. I get up the same time every morning. I eat the same thing for breakfast. I do the same thing at work pretty much every day. And I thought, well, this isn't boding well for our leadership together as church council president and pastor. But then this wonderful church council president went on to say that he'd been a member of this church for many, many years. And year after year, the church had longtime, wonderful, faithful members pass away, and they were not being replaced by new members. So my church council president said to me, I'm not a person who necessarily likes change, but I know that we need to change in order to move into the future that God has for us. He was essentially saying the pain of losing these longtime leaders motivated him, and of course others, to change. So the pain helps to motivate the change. And then a 9th thing is remain connected with people. Remain in relationship with people. This is another important piece. It's kind of like the heart piece. If you're just leading from the head without the relationship and the connection where you can interact, communicate with, explain the change, that's going to help a change to be much, much more successful. In that reference, I had some great advice from a mentor of mine moving into a situation where a lot of change needed to take place. My friend Greg said, love your congregation. You can't get where you're going with them, but you can't get where you're going without them. You need to stay in connection, stay in relationship with people. Be flexible, be willing to lose, choose your battles, be gracious when you lose or when you win. Remain connected and with people along the way. One of the best compliments I ever got, I actually got after somebody had passed away. He was one of my leaders in a previous congregation. And when he passed away, his widow said to me that he didn't always like the changes that I was making in the church, but he always appreciated the way I had gone about them and the reasons why I was leading those changes. So, remain connected and in relationship with people. And then last, acknowledge and manage loss. It is sometimes said that people don't fight against change, they fight against loss, the things that will be painful or difficult for folks. Don't minimize it. Realize that folks are going to struggle with that. And like any grieving, it will sometimes take some time and some healing to move through change. Now, I want to end by summarizing just one more book about leading change that I think offers some good help as well. It's called Leading Change Without Losing It by Kerry Newhoff, a very gifted church leader. And here's a quick summary of his book, just a couple more thoughts on change. He says, note how many people are frustrated. When you're making a change, there are going to be people who are frustrated, but you can't, stop the bus, if you will, for two people of a congregation of, hundreds just because they're frustrated. So, ask yourself who really is frustrated about a change. Also, who is your focus? Or is your focus on the people who are in the congregation or who are outside of the congregation who don't yet have a relationship with Jesus? You don't want to only cater to folks who are inside the church, but also think about changes that will connect with someone who's outside. He says, where are you going to kind of have your filters? To what questions and what people are you really going to listen to when you're going about change? Make sure you're kind of listening to the right advice and the right people. He also encourages attack problems, not people, going to what we were talking about before about staying in relationship to people. Don't attack people, even if their ideas are different. Attack the problems. And then he says, don't quit. Keep at it, be persistent, because change does take hard work. Well, I hope that this has been a wonderful church leader tool for you, and particularly if you are thinking about a change that you either are in the midst of or that you're going to be leading soon, that you've been able to apply this to the things in that particular change. And always, if this has been helpful, pass this on to some other leaders in your context or some friends or whoever who are in the midst of leading change. Take care and God bless.